Hi, my name is Rich Hatfield. I'm a senior conservation biologist for the Xerces Society and the project coordinator for the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas project. Thanks in advance for watching our training webinars. Please note that these webinars were recorded live and included question and answers from the audience. We've edited some of those answers and questions to make this a little bit more straightforward for those of you watching after the fact. Whether you're watching these for the first time or trying to get a refresher, we hope they'll help you learn how to participate in the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas and why it's important. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with us via email at bumblebees@xerces.org, or you can find more information on our website. Thanks again for watching. Enjoy the webinar.
My goal here is not to make you the greatest bumblebee expert in the world. There's a very slim chance that that is going to happen after this very short workshop. My goal is to try to give you the tools that you need to begin an exploration of a species. Any bumblebees are like any taxa. There's, little minor differences between species that take, hours of observations in order to be able to tell the difference between them. So, I've looked at thousands upon thousands of bumblebees at this time, and I still occasionally will reach out for help. So, you're beginning exploration, just like if you've ever learned how to identify birds or flowers or whatever, you recognize that it's a challenging landscape. So my goal here is to sort of give you some tools to start using the guidebooks. This is not a substitute for a guidebook or anything else. It's just to share some of my expertise with you. So here we go. We're going to dive right in. We already did that. So here we go. The first thing to recognize is that there are a lot of lookalike bumblebees, or a lot of lookalike animals. So many species look a lot like bumblebees, and the reason that is because bumblebees can sting, and therefore, if you're an animal that looks like a bumblebee, then a bird is probably less likely to eat you because they don't want to get stung on the tongue. So there's some protection that comes from mimicry from non-stinging animals. There's only one bee on this whole slide, and that's right down there in the lower left there. That's the only bee on this slide. So there are a lot of mimics out there, and we want to do a good job of trying to not capture and not gather the mimics. So here's going to be another poll question for you. Which one of these is a bumblebee? Let's see if I can pull up that poll. So which one of those do you think is a bee or a bumblebee? So good. Most of you are answering correctly. It is the second image there. B is the answer. The main way to tell the difference between these two is you'll notice that the bee has long linear antennae, and the fly here on the left has really short stubby antennae. You can see the short stubby antennae here and the long linear antennae here. And then the bee actually has pollen on its leg here. So they have mechanisms for carrying pollen, and the flies do not. So there's our bee. And then there's also other bees that look like bumblebees. So which one of these is a bumblebee? A or B? Again, most of you are answering correctly, which is great. So the animal on the right there, B, again, you can see that clear pollen basket. And the animal on the left is actually a carpenter bee. It's not a bumblebee. And the main way to tell the difference between a carpenter bee and a bumblebee is to look at the abdomen. So here the abdomen is the very back of the bee, and you can see the abdomen here has no hairs on it. It's completely shiny. You can see the light reflecting off of it. And here the bumblebee is completely hairy. So carpenter bees are warm weather specialists. We find more species the further south we go, at least to the equator there. And then bumblebees are more cold weather specialists. So we're going to find them in our more temperate areas. Okay, good. So hopefully those of you that weren't able to answer those two questions correctly will benefit from some of this, and hopefully even those of you that did answer correctly will gain some expertise as well. So the flow chart really, if you're to recognize sort of a bumblebee, starts with seeing a bee on a flower. And there's basically a flow chart you're going to go through of asking yourself, is this a bee or not a bee? And then once you know that it's a bee, you need to find out whether it's some other species of bee. And remember, there's 3,550 species in North America. That's going to be some separate identification guide. I'm not going to go through the other 3,550 species today. And then once you know it's a bumblebee, you need to determine whether it's a male or a female. And then once you know whether it's a male or a female, you need to determine whether it's a cuckoo bumblebee, which is in the subgenus Xerces, or a true bumblebee in the genus, these are sort of our true social bumblebees. And the same thing with females. We're going to find out whether it's a cuckoo bumblebee or a true bumblebee. And I'm going to walk you through each of these decision trees right now. So we've gone through carpenter bees. Remember, you're going to be looking for that shiny abdomen is going to tell the main difference between bumblebees and carpenter bees. So that shiny, shiny abdomen is the main determining factor. But generally, bees are going to have 4 wings, so they have 2 pairs of wings. The females carry pollen through the landscape. They usually have hairs all over their body. They have long linear antennae, and their eyes are on the sides of their heads. In contrast, flies have only 2 wings, and they're usually kind of flimsy looking wings. They don't carry pollen. They're usually not hairy, and they have large bulging eyes at the front of their head and short, stubby antennae. And again, here's another picture of a lookalike fly that looks a heck of a lot like a bumblebee. You see those short, stubby antennae and those light, flimsy wings and huge eyes at the front of its face there. Wasps can sometimes be confused for bees. They're very closely related to bees. They do have 4 wings, but they don't carry pollen. They have skinny legs, and they're generally not very hairy. I also just want to take this opportunity to give you a public service announcement, especially those of you that are living in Washington State. There's been a lot of outreach right now about the giant hornet. There's trapping programs that are ongoing, and we've been hearing many reports that people are killing bumblebees, bumblebee queens, thinking that they are giant hornets. So this is my public service announcement to you so that you can understand and hopefully help educate other people that bumblebees are not the giant hornet. So this is what the giant hornet looks like. You can tell it has very few hairs on its body. It looks very armored. And this is what a giant hornet looks like next to a bumblebee. Okay, so you can see much more robust bodies for the bumblebee. There's hairs everywhere. The color patterns that you see on the bee itself come from the hairs, not the body parts, which is what we see on the wasp. So this is actually the color of the skin, whereas the bumblebee, these are hairs that are colored. And then you can see the extreme size difference here on the bottom. So the giant hornet is 4 centimeters long, which is almost 2 inches. So very big, big, big animals. And most bumblebees are less than 2.5 centimeters. Okay, a big bumblebee queen is going to be 1 inch, maybe 1.5 inches. So these are much longer and much more narrow, whereas bumblebees are going to be big and wide. Another picture of a bumblebee next to a giant hornet. This is a cuckoo bumblebee, which typically look a little more wasp-like. So I just thought I'd throw this picture in there as well. But you can still see there's hairs all over their body and very different looking creatures. And again, the color patterns come from the hairs, not from the body themselves. And then here's a side look. So here's a bumblebee. You can see how hairy they are and how hairless the giant hornet is. So please don't kill bumblebees thinking that they're giant hornets. I know I'm probably preaching to the choir on this, but we need to do a better job of raising awareness, especially since the New York Times article came out and people are calling these murder hornets and all of the other terrible things. I also just want to let you know that there's only ever been 2 of these observed in North America. Or there was a nest found on Vancouver Island last year, and then a single individual was found in far northern Washington. And those are the only observations in North America ever. One has not been detected in 2020 yet, unless there's information that I don't know yet. So we have no evidence that these are established. And we also have, they've been called murder hornets because they've been known to kill people. There are, 5 billion people that live in Asia, and 50 of them die a year from stings from these. So, we're talking about a minute fraction of the population. I'm sure just as many people die in the United States from honeybee stings and wasp stings as people die from the giant hornet. This is not something that we need to be afraid about. I think we just need to, obviously, if they get established here, we're going to worry about honeybees and adapt to that situation, but this is not a major concern at this point. So let's try to boil down the furor over it. And I hope that all of you can help me to share that public service announcement with your friends and family. So now, moving through that decision tree, now hopefully you can distinguish a bee from most of its other lookalikes. And now how do we tell a bumblebee from other bees? I've shown you how to tell the difference between bumblebees and carpenter bees. Honeybees and bumblebees is also pretty simple. Honeybees, like carpenter bees, don't have a lot of hairs on their abdomen. The colors that you see there come from their skin. They have pretty narrow torpedo-shaped abdomens. And bumblebees are big and robust and hairy and look a lot different than honeybees. And again, the color patterns here come from hairs, not from the color of their skin. That's going to be the most likely lookalike. There are some other species that look a lot like bumblebees. And the best way to tell those are going to be to look at the pollen carrying mechanism. I'm not going to go into detail on that today, but you can find other resources to look for that. So this is, once you know that you have a bumblebee, now we need to start determining whether it's a male or a female. And bumblebees, like other insects, have 3 body parts. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And mostly we're going to be looking to tell whether it's a male or a female. We're going to be looking at the antennae and the leg, the hind leg, and the abdomen. Those are the body parts that we're going to look at to distinguish males from females. It's really important to recognize that males and females often look very different from each other. Males are notably very difficult to identify from photographs because they often are so variable and look so different. So most of what I'm sharing with you today is focused on the females, which is the workers and the queens. And so sometimes queens look different than workers, and almost always males look different than the females. These 3 casts are often out during different times of year. We're targeting the middle of the season from June through August because we're trying to get as many workers as we can. We're targeting the workers of the bumblebees so that we can find the most species. To tell a male from a female, that said, I should go back and just say, if you capture males, please still do submit photos of them. We often can identify them. They're just a little bit harder, but please still do submit data if you do catch males. So females generally, they groom themselves a lot because they're always cleaning pollen off of their bodies. So they look like they're groomed. They look like they've combed their hairs generally. Males tend to have hair that go up all over the place, not too different than the human species. Additionally, females have 6 abdominal segments, and they have a corbicula. So the corbicula is their parent pollen carrying mechanism. You can compare the legs of the male to the female here in a cartoon. So females carry pollen, so they have big hardy hind legs, and males have these skinny legs. Males have an extra antennal segment. And each segment tends to be a little bit longer. So the males have really long antennae. So here's our two female bumblebees. You can see this one's really well groomed, and this one's carrying pollen. So those are the things that we're looking for. And then male bumblebees, again, they're going to be shaggy. They have an extra abdominal segment, which tends to be a little bit rounder, and they have those longer antennae. And then some species have these big, large eyes at the front of their head, almost like a fly. So there you can see the large eyes, and then you can sort of see the shaggy hairs here, and then the skinny leg on the male bumblebee there. And then once we've determined whether it's a male or a female, we're then going to try to determine whether it's a cuckoo bumblebee or a true bumblebee. And we're going to do that by looking at the hind leg. So these are all close-ups of the hind leg of a bumblebee. This is a cuckoo male bumblebee. And you can see there are hairs, the entirety of this segment of its hind leg where the female would carry pollen. In the cuckoo bumblebee, it's all covered in hairs. And then if we compare that to a male, of a true bumblebee, a non-cuckoo bumblebee, they have this hairless area in the middle. So they sort of have a remnant of pollen carrying. So again, I'll compare that for you. Cuckoo leg, universally hairy, true bumblebee, hairless area in the middle of the males. The same is true of the females. So this is a female cuckoo hind leg. It's convex, so this is actually coming out of the screen out at you, and it's again universally hairy. And if we compare that to the true bumblebee, which is actually concave, and it has hairs on the outside forming that corbicula. So this is where the true bumblebee would fill with pollen. And because cuckoo bumblebees don't carry pollen, they've lost that corbicula over time. They no longer have that phenotype on their body. So again, cuckoo female and true female. So mostly we're going to be looking at color patterns on the head, thorax, and abdomen. And the abdomen is broken up into 6 segments. And when I talk about individual species, I'll be talking about which of these segments, T1, T2 through T6, are which color. And that's what we're going to be paying attention to. And then sometimes we also look at the cheek length. Different bumblebees have different length tongues, and that will correspond to the length or the distance between the eye and the mandibles in the bee. And sometimes we use that to identify different close lookalike species. So for example, here's a long-tongued bumblebee, which has a very long cheek, and here's a short-cheeked bumblebee, which has a very short cheek. But as I said, mostly we're going to be looking at color patterns to identify bumblebees. There's 2 main resources available for the Western U.S. Bumblebees of North America is a guidebook available from Princeton University Press. And then Bumblebees of the Western United States is a guide that was put out by the Forest Service. It's actually available for free as a PDF download. You can find it on the internet. And I think there's a link to it on our website as well. You can also use the Bumblebee Watch app to identify things. And then I'm going to share a resource with you in a minute here that you can also use. All right, so that's sort of the brief introduction to how we might go about identifying bumblebees. And now I'm going to introduce you to the individual species. It might be really helpful for you if you have this guide to follow along with. You can download it. Hopefully Katie has a link that she can share with you in the chat, or you may have already downloaded it and seen it. I'm going to go through each of these sections. I'm going to go through the red on the body, through the striped bumblebees, through the whites, and just introduce you to how to use this sheet to help you to identify the bumblebees that you see when you're doing your survey. And something that I should say before I go any further and before I forget, you don't have to identify your bumblebees. That's my job. That's Katie's job. We identify the bumblebees. We want you to take really good photos and submit your photos. So don't feel overwhelmed by this, that you have to actually know all of this information and be able to distinguish these species. You can just submit all of your data as bumblebee, and I, as the expert that identifies these, will put a name on them if I can. So don't feel like you need to master this in order to participate in this project. In reality, all I need you to be is a photographer. But I know that a lot of people want to get better at identifying things and like to put names on things. So that's why I'm going through this. But again, please don't feel like you need to become an expert in order to participate in this project. So we're going to start with the reds. We're going to go through the species that have red on them. And I'm really going to only introduce you to the kind of most common ones, but we'll go through them species by species. And not necessarily in the same order that you see there, but we will go through each of them quickly. So this is Bombas Farias. You can see the cartoon down here in the lower right, and then here is an actual photograph of the bumblebee. This species has what we call cloudy hairs on it. So it's a mix of black and yellow hairs in front of the wings. And you can actually see the same thing on the cartoon here. So you can see how there's bright yellow behind the wings, and then kind of dark muddied hair in front of those wings. That's a very diagnostic feature of this species. It has the same feature on T4 back here. So it goes yellow, red, red, and then there's this cloudy T4 as well. And that's the best way to identify that species, is to look for those cloudy hairs. And then on the abdomen, it's going to have that yellow, red, red, yellow pattern. It's notable that this species, if you get down near Ashland, Oregon, actually loses its red, and there's a black color form of this species. These are the areas that we see this species in the Pacific Northwest, so it tends to be either a western species or a mountain species. We don't see it very frequently in the intermountain west. Bombas centralis is another red, a species with red on it. This one has no cloudiness, so the hairs on the thorax are all yellow, and then the abdomen, it goes yellow, yellow, red, red. And we're looking again for another thing that's obvious about this one, is that clear black band in between the wings. You don't see that with Bombas melanopigus because of those cloudy hairs on the front of the thorax. So that clear black band is another good indicator here. And then Bombas centralis we find is in the central of the country. So this is a sagebrush steppe intermountain species more than it is a mountain or west side species. Bombas mixtus is the most common animal you're going to find that has a red tail. So red goes all the way to the back of the abdomen. These are early emerging species. They're out now. These are the ones that nest in birdhouses occasionally. So does Bombas melanopigus. And again, this species also has cloudy hairs up here on the thorax, especially in front of the wings. You can see it probably better on the cartoon than you can in the photograph. But we're going to look mostly for that red tail and the cloudy hairs. And then this species is quite common. Don't find it so much in the Intermountain West, but in west side of the Cascades and throughout the mountainous areas, it seems to be quite common. The next species is Bombas rufosinctus. I've put two color patterns up here. In reality, this is the most diverse species that we have. There are probably 13 or 14 or maybe more than that different color patterns for this same species. It can be very difficult to identify. So just beware that these are not the only two color forms that you're likely to see, and that you're even likely to see these very same two color forms in the same meadow. So beware, this is a tricky species. One of the most common things for this species is this yellow crescent that you see here on T2. So the second segment of this bee has a yellow crescent that comes down on it. It's usually surrounded by black hairs or by red hairs, depending on what color form that you have. But that's the main thing that we're going to look for with this species. It also has an incredibly short cheek. So it's got a very round face, and the distance between its eye and its mandibles here is very short. This species is not common everywhere, but where it is common, it can be very common. So we find it, one of the more common areas is in this northern area of Washington up here outside of Spokane. It can be very common up in those areas in little pockets. So it's not common everywhere, but where it is common, there does seem to be a lot of it. Bombas huntii is another red species. This looks a lot like Bombas melanopigus, but there's no cloudiness in front of the wings. Bright yellow hairs and strong black band between the wings. Also very clear pattern on T1 through T4 here of yellow, red, red, yellow, and no cloudiness on T4 there. So again, the black band and the clear pattern on the abdomen. This is an Intermountain West species. Sagebrush steppe habitat is where we find it most frequently. And those are our red-tailed species. Our most common of the red-tailed species are the ones that I just shared with you. So Bombas huntii, Bombas mixtus, Bombas melanopygus, Bombas rufocinctus, and Bombas centralis. And all of those should be on your Bumblebee data sheet that I shared at the beginning there. There are a couple of species that are also in that red box that aren't quite as common. This is Bombas sylvicola. Bombas sylvicola is a high elevation species. You probably wouldn't find it below 6,000 or 7,000 feet, but it does live higher in mountains. It has yellow hairs on T5. In the Rocky Mountains, like in Idaho, down through much of the state there, you'll find Bombas bifarius with red on it. And then Bombas flavifrons looks a lot like Bombas centralis, but it has those cloudy hairs throughout its thorax, and that's what we're going to be looking for with Bombas flavifrons. Quick glimpse of these. This is Bombas bifarius with red on it, so that's what it looks like in higher elevation areas and in Idaho. And then Bombas flavifrons, you can see it looks a lot like centralis, but you can see those cloudy hairs. It doesn't have that strong black band between the wings that we talked about with Bombas centralis. And then here's Bombas sylvicola. It has long, shaggy hair, and then hairs go all the way down here to T5, which none of the other ones did. So this is unique in this species. And this is observations of Bombas sylvicola. So we can only see it really at really high elevation areas throughout the state. And then here is just an observation of where you would see Bombas bifarius in the various color patterns. You can see the red sort of goes down the spine of the Rockies here. And otherwise, west of that, it doesn't have any red on it. So that's the red-tailed group. The next group I'm going to introduce you to is the striped group. The first one's Bombas bifarius. I just showed you this species with red on it. You're going to see it much more commonly without red on it. One of the major things we're looking at this species is this notch between the wings. Behind the wings here, you see that V. That V that you see there is very diagnostic for this species. And then also the yellow, black, yellow banding pattern on the abdomen. Those two things combined indicate Bombas bifarius. This species is incredibly common in the mountains and throughout much of the area. This is the most common bumblebee we've observed in the Pacific Northwest so far with the Atlas project. And here's Bombas fervidus or Bombas californicus. There's a sort of a west side californicus color form, which is the one you see pictured here. There's also a yellow color form, but there's also intermediaries between these. So you'll find some with only some yellow up here, and you'll see both extremes as well. The further east you go, the more likely you are to see the yellow color form here. But again, this species has a black face and a black top of the head. The vertex is black, and there aren't very many species with that feature. Some species have a black face, but the top of their head is yellow. This is one of only 2 or 3 species in the Pacific Northwest that has a black face and a black top of the head. And those are the things that we're looking at for this species. This species can be locally common. It is common in some of the urban areas. So you can see there's a lot of observations in and around Portland and Seattle, some in the Intermountain West. We don't see it too much in the mountains, interestingly enough. So interesting pattern for this bee that doesn't necessarily the same as some of the other patterns that we see with bees. Bombas vosnesenskii is going to be the most common yellow-faced, yellow-striped bee that you'll see. I'm going to go through these later. There are several others that look a lot like this, but this is the most common of those that you'll see. So yellow stripe on T4 and a yellow face. And this species is also very common in Oregon and Washington, especially west of the Cascades. There are many, many of these. These are out now in quite a bit of abundance. And that's the three most common of the striped groups. So Bombas bifarius, Bombas furvidus, and Bombas vosnesenskii. I'll go through some lookalikes of Bombas vosnesenskii towards the end of this. There's a few other species in the striped group that I'm giving honorable mention here. I'll go through Bombas caliginosus, and I'll go through all of these later at the end of this. But you can see Bombas caliginosus, Bombas insularis, and Bombas van Dijkii all have a yellow face and a yellow stripe. So we'll go through the details and how to distinguish those a little bit later in this presentation. Sorry, my computer is very slow at advancing slides right now, so I apologize for that. I'm not sure what's going on. Oh. PowerPoint just crashed, so the screen is going to change here. I'm going to have to oh, it's back, maybe? Nope. I'm going to have to pause here for a moment, everybody. I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties, but nothing I can do about it. My computer is in meltdown mode here. All right. Oh, and all of a sudden it wants to work, huh? Well, I can see a picture of my daughter skiing on Mount Hood. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Bear with me. Appreciate your patience. Okay. Maybe we'll be able to do this now. Okay, so those are the striped bees. Next, we're going to move on to the black-tailed bees. Let's see if we can move through these here. Yep, seems to be working. Katie, Ann, or Joel, will you let me know if this is not working on your end? It seems to be working on my end. If it is working, you don't have to say anything. So here's Bombas flavifrons. I talked about the species earlier. The further east you go with that species, you'll see it with red on it. Mostly you're going to see it without red on it, just like this. It's got cloudy hairs throughout its thorax. The first two segments of the abdomen are yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. So that's Bombas flavifrons. Cloudy hairs, blacktail. This species is very common. It can be locally extremely common. Has a very small body and a very, very long cheek. And that's one of the things we use to distinguish this species. So here's Bombas flavifrons on the far left with a very long cheek. And then there's a couple of lookalike species, Bombas sitchensis and Bombas mixtus. Bombas sitchensis has a medium cheek, and Bombas mixtus has a shorter cheek. The next black-tailed bee is Bombas vagans. This one is in very few areas of our three-state region. It's in sort of far northeastern Oregon and throughout much of eastern Washington and a little bit in Idaho, but this is not a very common species. But to distinguish it, it looks a lot like Bombas flavifrons, except it doesn't have any cloudiness here on its thorax. They're all bright yellow hairs, and it's just got a black dot right there in the middle, like you see here in the cartoon. The first two segments of its abdomen are yellow, and the rest of it are black. So that's what we're keying in on, is the black dot and yellow on it. Here's the distribution throughout the Pacific Northwest that we've gathered so far. So just here in northeastern Oregon, a little bit in eastern Washington, and then throughout some of northern Idaho. Bombas griseocolus, the brown-belted bumblebee, is the next species. It has a crescent of brown and sometimes yellow here on the second tergal segment. The species also has short, even hairs. It kind of looks like it just got shaved oftentimes. But this is also a cool picture if you haven't seen it yet, but it's actually in the jaws of a crab spider. So I did see a question and answer in the chat earlier. What are the predators of bumblebees? Definitely crab spiders are one of the major ones. So we're going to look for that crescent there of brown usually. Sometimes it's yellow on T2. The species is pretty broadly distributed. It's mostly a lower elevation and sagebrush steppe or drier habitats. So throughout some of the Willamette Valley, where it's drier in the summertime, and then throughout the Intermountain West here. Bombas nevadensis is our next black-tailed species. Again, this is the second species that we've seen so far, and I think it might be our last, except for one of our cuckoo bumblebees that has a black top of the head and a black face. This is also a very large bee. Loves sagebrush steppe habitat is where you're going to find it. This is the Palouse thistle that it's foraging on here. So again, we're looking for that black dot in the middle of the thorax, and then yellow on the first 3 tergal segments. So 1, 2, and 3 all have yellow hairs on it. And again, this usually has kind of dull yellow hairs compared to the species that we're going to look at next. Again, mostly a sagebrush steppe species, although we do see it some in the Portland and Seattle metro areas. Bombas morrisoni is the next species. This species looks a lot like Bombas nevadensis with 3 differences. One, the top of its head is yellow instead of black. While its face is black, the top of its head is yellow. It has no black dot in its thorax. It's all yellow hairs there. And then the hairs on its body tend to be this really bright golden color that is really unique. I haven't seen it in any other North American bumblebee species. It really stands out, especially when you see it in person, even more so than you see here in the picture. It's really a bright golden bumblebee. So no spot, bright yellow hairs, but it has the same color pattern generally as nevadensis, as 1, 2, and 3 are going to be yellow. We have very few observations of this species relative to how common it used to be, and all of those are in eastern Oregon and southern Idaho. But again, these are a lot of the areas that haven't been surveyed yet. So this is one of our species of greatest conservation need. And we haven't done a good job of surveying in the areas where it could be. So this is one of the reasons we need to get out to some of the sagebrush steppe habitat in southeastern Oregon and southern Idaho to conduct surveys. So if you're in a state where you feel like you're comfortable to travel and get out there and do some of those surveys, please get out there and help us find more observations of this bee and what plants that it's using out there. And that's the black-tailed group. Bombas vagans, Bombas nevadensis, Bombas morrisoni, Bombas flavifrons, and Bombas griseocolus. Uh-oh. It doesn't like when I transition between species here. We're slowing down again. I'm getting a blue wheel. Sorry, everybody. Thanks for your patience. I guess the technical difficulties haven't been too bad for a 4-hour go at it. Speaking of which, I'm looking at my clock here. It is about 4 o'clock. So if you do need to go, feel free to go, and you can watch the rest of this later. And thank you for coming. I think we're going to send out an evaluation form as well to you sometime. Well, if you close the window, I think it'll open an evaluation form. And if you fill that out, it's really, really helpful. And thanks for coming. And sorry we're going a little long here. I appreciate your patience for those of you that are sticking around, which is still quite a lot of you, which is awesome. A couple of species I'm throwing in here as black-tailed group for honorable mention because they don't technically have black tails. This is Bombas sitkensis. It looks a lot like Bombas flavifrons. It's got the cloudy hairs on the thorax, yellow on T1 and T2, but you can see there's just a hint of pale hairs there at the very back of the abdomen. So you need to watch out for those. And that's how we distinguish that species. And then Bombas mixtus sometimes has those brown hairs that are on its the back of its tip of its abdomen sometimes fade a lot towards black and can almost look like a black-tailed bumblebee. And then this is a not so honorable mention. So this is that species I talked about earlier, Bombas impatiens. This is a species that's commercially available and sold and used for greenhouse pollination. And this is the one we have observed in central Washington where there are greenhouses, but it's definitely established in far northern Washington near Blaine. And it's definitely established in British Columbia. So we're tracking this species as it expands in the Pacific Northwest and thinking about the implications of that moving forward. There's a photo of it. So this has a black face. The top of its head is yellow. And then the first segment of the abdomen is yellow and the rest of the abdomen is black. And here are the observations that we have so far. Here's that observation in central Washington. And then most of the observations are up here in Vancouver and far northern Washington. So those are the blacktails. Next, we're moving on to the whites. The first one has white on its shoulders. This is the white-shouldered bumblebee, Bombas Farias, another sagebrush steppe, very large-bodied bee. Does have this burnt orange color oftentimes. Sometimes it's more yellow or golden, but oftentimes it's this beautiful burnt orange color, another very large bee. And the white here is on its shoulders and on its face. This can be a somewhat common bee in some areas, especially in the sagebrush steppe and drier areas. And then Bombas occidentalis, this is another species of greatest conservation need. This species has a white tail. So generally we're gonna have a yellow thorax and then black all the way to a bright snow white tail. And it's pretty distinguished, it's pretty obvious here even in this picture, but when you see it in person, it's a very bright white color. This is the Rocky Mountain color form. So if you're working in Idaho or far eastern Washington, you might start to see some with a bit more yellow on it. The males will often sometimes look like this as well. So something to keep an eye out for if you're in Idaho or eastern Washington. But mostly we're looking at that white hairs on the back. And these are the observations that we have of this species so far. So again, we're finding it mostly in high elevation areas. In the Olympics is the furthest west that we've seen it, but almost nothing west of the Cascade Sierra crest except for a few observations in the Puget Trough. And these are actually several years old at this point. So these aren't part of the Atlas project. And then finally, the last species with the white is Bombas Franklinii. This is the species that will later this year be listed as an endangered species. It just has two little white tufts here on the side of T5. And otherwise, it's mostly black and looks a little bit like Bombas occidentalis and is actually very closely related to it. This species would only be found down near in far southwestern Oregon or northern California. It has not been seen since 2006. Some people believe it's extinct, although there are many remote areas down there, including grid cells that have not yet been sampled, where this species has not been looked for. So this is another huge opportunity to go out and do surveys and potentially find a species that hasn't been seen since 2006. That would be an incredible conservation story. But again, we're just looking for those two white dots on the side of the back of the abdomen there. And this is its range. Sorry, this is a terrible map. This is the California-Oregon line. This is Mount Shasta down here. And this is Medford, I think, up here. So very small range. Has the smallest range of any bumblebee in North America. And those are the whites, occidentalis, appositus, and franklinii. Okay, so that is definitely the most common species that you're gonna see. But just in case you weren't overwhelmed yet with all the information I've thrown at you, we're now gonna dive into some of the difficult species groups, which are mostly gonna be these yellow-faced, yellow-striped bees and our cuckoo bees. Our cuckoo bees are also, they A, look like each other, and B, they also look a lot like some of our true bumblebees. So we'll go through those. But you can see first, we're gonna go through these yellow-striped bees, yellow-faced, yellow-striped bees. On your form here, on your sheet, there's 4 different species that have yellow faces and yellow stripes on their abdomens. So how do we tell the difference between those? Well, the main way, and this is one of the main reasons in that flow chart at the beginning of the presentation, I told you that before you start trying to identify a species, you want to determine whether it's a cuckoo bumblebee or a true bumblebee. So that's the best way to eliminate Bombas insularis. If you've looked at that hind leg and you know that it's cuckoo bumblebee, then you're not going to confuse it with these other three. Okay, so that's the most important thing and why that step exists in the flowchart. But here they are. Here's Bombas caliginosus, Bombas van Dijkii, and Bombas vosnesenskii. You can see they all have very similar distributions in the Pacific Northwest. If you live in Idaho, you're lucky because you don't need to deal with these species. They're really only Oregon, Washington species. But they all have yellow faces and yellow stripes with some subtle differences. So Bombas caliginosus has yellow on its face and then also on T4. Notably, this species also has yellow on the sternal segment. So that's the underside of the abdomen. Remember in the video that I showed you earlier, I told you for yellow striped, yellow faced bees, you need to take a picture of the underside of the abdomen. And it's because I want to see whether there are yellow hairs there. That will help me distinguish Bombas caliginosus from Bombas van Dijkii from Bombas vosnesenskii. That's why we need to take that picture. Bombas van Dijkii is slightly different than caliginosus in that it has its yellow stripe on T3 rather than on T4. So the stripe is up a little bit higher on the body. This also tends to have a little bit longer hair than Bombas caliginosus, but it also has yellow on the underside of its abdomen. Bombas vosnesenskii is more or less a copy of Bombas caliginosus. It has shorter, even hair, and it has an all black belly. So all of those sternal segments have black hairs on it. There are no yellow hairs on the underside of its abdomen. And again, that's why I need that photo of the underside of the abdomen. So that's the difficult species group of the yellow-faced, yellow-striped bees. And then finally, to go through our cuckoo bumblebees. Our cuckoo bumblebees, look a lot like most of our true bumblebees. This probably helps them invade nests and other things. But they also look a lot like each other. But in reality, we can tell the difference between these three species by just looking at their heads. Once we've determined they're a cuckoo bumblebee by looking at their hind leg, we can just look at their head. So Bombas flavidus has a black face, but the top of its head is yellow. Bombas insularis has a yellow face and a yellow top of its head. And Bombas sucklei, again, this is our species of greatest conservation need, has a black face and the black vertex, or the top of the head, is fully black. Sometimes there's variation in the amount of yellow that it has on the rest of their body. So that's really one of the most reliable things to look at for these three. So if you have a cuckoo bumblebee, please do a very good job of taking a close picture of that face and the top of the head. Very helpful and very, very needed to see. The rest of it is pretty straightforward. They're and largely variable. So these notes actually aren't that helpful, other than this looks a lot like Bombas fervidus, and this looks a lot like Bombas Farias. So again, make sure to look at those hind legs and make sure whether you've got a true bumblebee or a cuckoo bumblebee. And that, if my PowerPoint will ever advance, is it. Those are all of the species that I've introduced you to. You now know how to identify pretty much any bumblebee that you would encounter, or any female bumblebee that you would encounter in the wild. And I know this is kind of a daunting look to have this many species as well as all the different color forms, but you know, when you break it up into these big patterns and just look at the ones with red, or just look at the ones that are striped, or you know, just look at the black-tailed ones, or just the ones with whites, or just the cuckoo bees, in the way that I have, it gives you a nice entry point to be able to you know, identify bumblebees, at least a little bit better than hopefully you could before, or at least that'll take you to the guidebook and give you some names to look up instead of having to know the bumblebees by family, which is how those, or by subgenus rather, which is how those guidebooks that I mentioned earlier are broken up. And that is really it. That's the entire project, more or less, of why bumblebee conservation is important, taking you through how to participate in the atlas, and then also how to identify the bumblebees that you find in your survey. I have one last poll question for you here, which is whether or not you felt that that was useful for helping you to identify bumblebees better. So just a quick poll there, if you could answer that, it'd be very helpful. Oh, look at that. That's great. Glad that it was helpful for many of you, or it looks like coming in, it looks like it's helpful for a lot of you. Certainly, oh, some people got confused, so a couple no's. That's all right. I'm glad that a lot of you found it to be useful, and hopefully, you can go back and watch it again and use the resources that I've shared with you to address, to go back and look at this again and refresh your memory. And the best thing you can do is just get out in the field and practice and submit your data to Bumblebee Watch and get feedback about how you're doing. And hopefully over time you can improve your skills, and then and then you can teach this class in the future. All right, so that is mostly all I've got for you. I'm going to take a quick peek in the question and answer here. I will say that when you go to log off, there's going to be an evaluation link that will, I think, be shared there. If you could spend some time filling that out and giving me some feedback about how we can make this better for you, that's really helpful for ways to improve this program as we move forward, especially as we move into this virtual world and have to do more of these virtual trainings. Any feedback you can provide at this point is helpful. I just also want to say thanks for your patience. I realized that I had some technical difficulties and the video was not great. We'll put all of those videos up on the website so you can watch them at real speed. And thanks for your patience and understanding with all of that. All right, so that one, I'm just taking a quick look at the questions here to see if there are any that are worth addressing here. And I will say that we'll go through the questions, and if there's any that we feel like we need to address, then we'll answer and post those questions on the website as well. The compasses on the ID chart indicate whether they're a sort of an east or west side species, and that's more or less dividing it by the cascades. So if you use the cascade as the east-west dividing line, that is what the compass means. The south one, that's for Bombas melanopygus, the black form of melanopygus, which would only be found south of about Medford, Oregon. Yes, there is an online gallery of the photos. Oh, not all of the photos in the presentation, no. Unfortunately not. Some of them are from professional photographers, so we don't do that. You will be provided the identification once you submit your data. When the experts review your data, you'll get an email indicating that your bumblebees have been identified, and you'll see whether you did it correctly or not. We can potentially share a copy of the question and answers. We can potentially do that. That's a good idea. Maybe we'll post that as well, or share it in some follow-up emails early next week. We'll send you a follow-up email. We have your email address if you registered to this. At this point, I would say no vouchers are necessary. Photos are just fine. You do not need to kill any bees. Photo vouchers should be good. Just do a nice job of capturing photos if you get rare bees. Anne, Joel, Katie, is there anything that I forgot? Well, I'm sure I've forgotten lots of things, but is there anything that we have time for that needs to be addressed before we say goodbye to folks?
No, you did a great job, Rich. I just would encourage everybody to remember that the protocol on the Bombas Atlas website, you guys really need to sit down and read that. This training was not a substitute for that. Once you read through that, literally more than once, probably, this will start to solidify and make a lot of sense on how to do surveys and how to do these identifications.
Thanks. Yeah, and please, I would say, use us as resources. Send us emails. We're all available to help you with this project and want to do that. So please use it. Continue to use us as a resource if you need to. I also just want to mention we have a Facebook group, a private Facebook group that if you're not engaged with yet, I really encourage you to get engaged with. There's a lot of very experienced people at this point that are very active in our Facebook group, and it's a great place to go to get your plants identified or to ask questions about how to conduct a survey, or if you want to try to connect with somebody else that has adopted your grid cell, it's a great place to do that as well. So you can find a link to it on the website, and maybe someone just threw it in the chat there as well. But I do encourage you to log in there. I'm not trying to promote Facebook or anything, but it has been a really helpful forum for a lot of people to interact with other users and to find a community of people that are interested in similar issues. So please use that as a resource. It's a great way to get questions answered. I also did see a question earlier about if you can't identify your flowers, can you just submit photos? You can do that. But it's really preferred for you to try to do that work on your own. I'm already trying to identify 8,000 bumblebees a year from photos, and when I also have to identify plants, which I'm not nearly as good at, it slows me down dramatically. So try to use the apps and other resources that are out there to identify your plants to the best of your ability. And I appreciate you taking the time to do that. It really reduces the amount of time that I have to spend if I don't have to go through photos and then send those photos to Anne and ask her to do them. So please try to do that on your own, and use the resources that are available. And the Facebook page is one place to do that. And there are some other great wildflower apps as well. And if there's nothing else from Anne or Joel, I'm gonna say thank you very much for coming today and spending a number of hours with us. I realize this is a lot of material, and like Joel said, please use the website as a resource to refresh yourself, to read through some of the written material. There's links there in our resources page about where to find nets and other equipment. There's also little short videos about how to plan a point survey in an area you've never been before, or how to plan a roadside survey using Google Maps. There's a ton of helpful little videos and pointers and tips there, and so please continue to use the website as a resource.